There is a mountain in central Germany that has been associated with witchcraft for longer than the word witchcraft has existed in the German language. The Brocken, the highest peak in the Harz mountains. On a clear day, you can see it from 100 kilometers away, about 60 miles, rising above everything else, like it's trying to remind you it's there. I have stood on its summit on the night of April 30th. I will tell you what that was like, but first, let me tell you what the mountain is. The Harz Mountains sit in the middle of Germany, roughly where the old east-west border used to run. The Brocken itself was actually inside East Germany for decades, closed off, militarized, topped with Soviet surveillance equipment, which means that for an entire generation, the most mythologized mountain in German folklore was physically inaccessible to most Germans. There's something fitting about that. The mountain that was always supposed to be forbidden was, for a while, actually forbidden. It reopened in 1990. The fences came down, the tourists came. There's a narrow gauge steam railway now that takes visitors up to the summit. There are gift shops, and there is a hotel. And yet, the Brocken does not feel like a place that has been domesticated. It feels like a place that has allowed certain structures to be built upon it and reserves the right to change its mind. The summit sits at 1,141 meters. That's about 3,743 feet. That doesn't sound dramatic until you realize that the surrounding landscape is relatively flat, which means the Brocken rises abruptly, visibly, unavoidably. The upper slopes are above the tree line, which is unusual for this latitude. The climate up there is closer to Scandinavia than to central Germany, cold, wet and foggy. On average, the summit is shrouded in cloud more than 300 days a year. And then there is the phenomenon the Germans call the Brocken spectra. When the conditions are right, when the sun is low behind you and the fog is thick in front of you, and you are standing near the edge of the summit, your shadow is projected onto the clouds below, enormous, ringed with a halo of refracted light. Imagine encountering that for the first time, before science, before any framework for understanding what you are seeing. You walk the edge of a fog-covered mountain, and you see in the clouds a giant shadowy figure surrounded by light. What would you think you were looking at? The association between the Brocken and witchcraft predates Christianity in Germany. The old Germanic tribes who lived in these forests held the high places as sacred, not holy or protected, but set apart, charged, belonging to powers that humans approached carefully and on specific terms. When Christianity arrived, the gatherings associated with the mountain were reframed as diabolism. The Blocksberg, they called it, the witches' Sabbath. The night of April 30th, Walpurgis Night, became the fixed point. The night when the witches flew to the summit for the great annual gathering. Goethe put it in Faust. It appeared in folklore collections across 3 centuries, and the witch trials on the 16th and 17th centuries turned the mythology into something with real human cost. Women accused of flying to the Brocken, confessions extracted under torture, executions carried out. I mention that not as a footnote. The mythology and the atrocity are inseparable. The mountain's reputation was built in part on the suffering of people accused of visiting it. That weight doesn't go away. You feel it up there if you're paying attention. What I find genuinely strange, not as mythology, but as documented historical record, is how consistent the underlying reports are across the centuries, not the theological framing which changes with the times, but the reports themselves. Lights on the upper slopes, sounds that don't match the wind, figures in the fog. A chronicle from the 13th century, a Lutheran pastor in the 16th, a naturalist conducting weather research in the early 19th century who wrote in his field notes. The sounds on this night are unlike those I have observed on any other occasion. They are not the wind, though. The wind is present. They are something within the wind, or beneath it. Three writers, 600 years apart, the same observation. I went up to the train in the late afternoon on April 30th. The fog was already thick by the time we reached the summit. Temperature had dropped to around 4 degrees Celsius, about 39 Fahrenheit, and the wind was constant, not gusting, just steady and cold and indifferent. The way mountain wind is when it's not performing for anyone. There were other people, of course. There were tourists, locals, people in witch hats carrying plastic broomsticks. The gift shop was open. Someone was selling hot wine, and yet there is something about its summit in that fog that resists the overlay of normalcy. The fog moves in ways that feel deliberate. The wind makes sounds in the rocks that are almost linguistic. And when the light caught it right, I saw my own shadow thrown enormous across the cloud below me. The Brocken spectre, textbook example. Knowing exactly what it was, even understanding the optics completely, something in my chest still responded to it as a warning. I stayed until after dark. Most of the tourists left on the last train down. I had arranged to stay at the hotel on the summit, a decision that had seemed slightly eccentric when I made it, and seemed considerably more eccentric by the time I was standing alone outside at 11 o'clock at night, with the fog so thick I couldn't see the hotel lights from 15 meters away. That's roughly 50 feet. I want to be careful about what I tell you next. I am not someone who goes looking for experiences to confirm pre-existing beliefs. I went to the Brocken on Walpurgis Night because the history demanded it, because I needed to know what it actually felt like to be there. The worst case, I told myself, was a cold night on a foggy mountain and good material. So understand what I'm about to describe, I have no comfortable explanation for it. At some point after midnight, I had lost track of time, which is itself unusual for me. I became aware of a sound, not the wind, something underneath the wind, a low, rhythmic sound that I initially took for the hotel's heating system or some mechanical infrastructure on the summit, but it moved. It was directional. It came from somewhere out in the fog and shifted slowly, as if the source was circling the summit. Slowly, deliberately. I stood very still and listened for a long time. Eventually it stopped, or it moved far enough away that I could no longer hear it over the wind. I went aside. I did not sleep particularly well. In the morning, with daylight and coffee, I told myself it was the wind, a trick of acoustics, sound traveling strangely through fog at altitude, maybe. But I keep coming back to what the hotel staff member said to me at breakfast when I mentioned I'd been outside late. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, very simply, "You should stay inside on that night." I asked her why. She smiled, but not warmly, and she said, "Because some things that come to the mountain on that night don't know the difference between a visitor and an invitation." Then she refilled my coffee and moved to the next table. After I came back, I spoke with someone whose account I want to share. The name she gave me permission to use is Maren. She's in her late 50s, a former academic, now retired and living in the Harz region. She was at pains to tell me someone who believes in witches. She went to the Brocken on Walpurgis Night about 15 years ago for a historical research project. She was there professionally with a notebook, studying the folk customs. She stayed late, walked to the far edge of the summit plateau, away from the lights and the last remaining tourists. She stood in the dark and the fog, and then she saw the lights. Not the hotel, not any structure. Lights out in the fog, below the summit, moving along the upper tree line. Small, warm-colored, not quite the quality of electric light. Moving slowly, not drifting the way refracted lights drift. Moving with what she described carefully as apparent purpose. She watched them for several minutes. She wrote in her notebook what she was seeing. She looked away to right, looked back up. They were gone. I asked her what she thought they were. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I have 4 explanations I find scientifically plausible. I spent 15 years going through them. None of them fully accounts for what I saw. And then she said something I thought about every day since. I think the mountain is genuinely strange, not in a supernatural sense, necessarily. I mean, there are things that happen there. Physical phenomena, atmospheric conditions, perhaps something geological that produce experiences which don't map cleanly into our usual categories. And I think people have been having those experiences for a very long time. The mythology grew around these experiences, not the other way around. She paused, then added, but I also think that some of what people have seen on that mountain across the centuries was real, not metaphorical, real. What it is, I cannot tell you, but I don't think 1,000 years of consistent reports come from nothing. The Brocken has been absorbing human interpretation for over 1,000 years. Sacred site, place of diabolism, military installation, tourist destination. It has outlasted every frame we've tried to put around it. I have a recording from that night. Ambient sound captured on my phone, just to have it. I've listened to it many times. The wind is there, distant voices, and then, just after midnight, if you listen carefully with headphones, something low, rhythmic, moving. I don't know what it is. The Brocken has never offered an explanation. It has only ever offered the experience. The last night of April, it offers something more.